in the room, I guess, because you read the poster, and I will limit the introduction to the poster. My wife told me that fools' names and fools' faces are often seen in public places. And this week has been quite a week for the Media Lab, because not only are we a lot in the press, but many people used to use words like charlatan to sort of describe either me or students or other faculty at the Media Lab, and yet some companies seem to be investing $9 billion on last Thursday and $20 billion on Friday, and sort of $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and it starts to add up to real money. And people are beginning to believe that maybe some of these things that we were talking about were important. And so the thing that interests me a little bit, and what I'd like to do is not use the full time to sort of give you a lecture, but sort of open it up for questions. But what interests me is that now that we were right, okay, so we were right 5 years ago, we were right 8 years ago, what's going to happen next? In other words, what are some of the consequences? And when we put together the Perspectives series of lectures, which was done last spring, I thought that this presentation would be sort of a sales job for undergraduates interested in joining our undergraduate degree program. But that has been stalled, not delayed or really put off, but at least the sort of final decision as to whether we're going to offer one seems to be a little bit more further out in time than I had planned. So really today's presentation isn't a sales job for undergraduates, but to try and explain to you, because I see so many faces in the audience that are people who are at the Media Lab, to try and explain to you why this is all going on now. What has happened in the past 6 months that's so big and so different? And how will that sort of change the next 12 months? And if you don't think it's, next 12 years, if you don't think it's big, if you don't think the change is big, a story that I'm fond of telling, and I'll even use the names of the people because Viacom is one of the sponsors of the Media Laboratory, a very generous one. Viacom owns Showtime. And sponsors get to ask us to do almost anything, and usually we do it. And in this case, they asked me to go out to Phoenix to talk to the Showtime people who were meeting sort of one of these executive schmoozing things that happens where sort of the company plans the future and sort of you get to sort of all meet each other in a very nice environment like Phoenix in the middle of February. And that was the morning that John Markoff of the New York Times had written the story on internet radio. And I don't know how many of you remember that, but it was in the left-hand column of the New York Times above the crease. Now that's a pretty important piece of news, and it was on internet radio, and the CEO of Showtime, with whom I had breakfast, said he had read it, and it was so interesting that he called his broker and said, buy shares in internet. Now, since then, people like Rupert Murdoch and others have bought into and are sort of interested in internet as a phenomenon, because there are very few phenomena where they can really talk about 1 million users added each month, and that they talk about 20% per month growth. And if you look at the current rate of growth of the internet, it intersects with the world population in 1998, literally. So if it continues at the current growth, every human being on Earth will be on the internet by 1998. That's quite extraordinary. And people take those sort of numbers quite seriously, and they start sort of looking at what's happening. And it's really been in a very short period of time. And that period is here. And so people ask why, and that's what I'd like to try and explain. And I'm going to do it in sort of 3 ways. And first of all, and I'm going to use some old-fashioned slides to do this. First of all, I'm going to describe sort of 4 trends. And none of them are going to surprise you, Okay, you're not going to be knocked over. But the fact that all four of them are happening simultaneously has, I think, an enormous impact. The second thing I'm going to do for those few people in the audience who aren't members of the Media Lab is I'm going to use some examples from the lab to describe what I think is kind of a new way of thinking, or sort of why new perspectives are so important. And then the last, and I guess the most important part, is really sort of why bits are bits, and sort of how that has an impact. So that's my plan, and I'll try and do it in 30 or 40 minutes, and then use the rest of the time for questions. So if we can produce the first slide. I don't know, Ben, are you controlling the house lights? Okay, can we just dim the front, or shut the front? People, I was nagged by Penny Blaisdell, now the lights are off and you cannot videotape me anymore. Right, we just want the house lights to be low enough so the video cameras stop working. I was nagged for a title, and that this is a title I produced, and everybody thought it was just to do with confusion. And it has a sort of limp sort of came out of these words. And convergence is on everybody's tongue these days. And let's go right to the first of the four trends. Now, do I control these? Let me get us a remote control unit, which I can probably find. See, I've turned the lights down so much to avoid the cameras, I can't see the remote control unit. There we go. This is the first, and look, as I said, you're not going to be knocked over by these, but when they all happen together, it's pretty interesting. Maybe you can focus it a little bit up there. It's hard. I don't seem to have focus control here, but there we go. Fine, super. This is, unfortunately, George Gilder gave this my name, which is very embarrassing, and it's just a piece of common sense. But there really seems to be a switch that's happening, or a trading of places between the information that we've been getting through wired and wireless environments. And when you look at this, it's obviously not true in any absolute way. But what's interesting to, again, people who are less technical than you, the assumption is that spectrum is rather plentiful. Now, that isn't true for people in the business, but most people will just use as a working assumption that spectrum is almost as plentiful as anything else. And it really isn't. Yet bandwidth in the wired world is a little bit like computer memory, in the sense that if you need more of it, you can manufacture it. And we can keep laying fiber forever. So when you get out in time, and you can disagree with the numbers, when you get out in time, finally you're probably going to use spectrum to communicate with things that move. Okay, that's obviously not going to be a law or a hard, but you're really going to need it. You cannot communicate with an automobile radio or a dog collar or a scuba tank or a parachute or an airplane or whatever, except in the wireless world. So there's going to be a fair amount of switching. And of course, in this sort of period in the middle is where you get the thing. So that's trend number one. And remember, you have to integrate these all at the end. Trend number two is kind of unsettling for the computer manufacturers, and it's that the desktop is vanishing. I'm going to call it the vanishing desktop. And I mean that in several ways. First of all, when people think of desks, they think of offices. This year will be the first year that over 50% of all personal computers sold worldwide will be sold into the home. And that's a pretty big number. It's actually a rather interesting number. So in some sense, if you think of desktop as synonymous with office, it's vanishing in that sense. It's vanishing in another sense, and that is that we're all getting more peripatetic. It's not just Seymour Papert and I who are always traveling, but it's sort of people are getting more mobile and using that mobility not just to spend time on airplanes, but using, again, the mobility to work differently. I ran in last weekend to the office manager of Chaya Day, which is sort of an advertising agency based out of Los Angeles, relatively well-known one. They are eliminating all of their offices and desks as of January 1st. Nobody will have a desk or an office at Chai Day. I mean, things like that are starting to happen, which I find pretty interesting. And of course, the third is that this is being replaced by sort of that metaphor, and you see it so often, and we've used it in our sort of literature, but it's happening again so fast. If you see a lot of people wearing pagers at the Media Lab as part of that mobility, but it's also happening in other ways. One of the slides I like to show, which is this one, is the kind of apparatus that you might be wearing, and people say, "Oh God, nobody will ever wear this sort of thing." Well, that's what people said about the Walkman, and look what happened. Some of you know the Private Eye. I think we even have a working one in the building someplace. I've actually read the New York Times while driving an automobile, which is something that I hope the Department of Transportation makes illegal eventually. But the image is at infinity, and it does merge, and so on. And of course, it's typical sort of keeping your sort of hands-free computing, as it's called. I don't know what he's doing with his hands. At any rate, the third trend is again not new to a lot of people, but it really is a trade-off between bandwidth and intelligence, and that we don't know very much about it. We know if you compute a lot, you probably have to send less. But we tend to know that in sort of the teleconferencing sense, where you sort of crunch on bits and you do sort of the sorts of things that many people in this building have been doing, and that is you just trade off MIPS for a certain amount of bandwidth. And that's not the one that's the most interesting. The one that's the most interesting is where you send bits back and forth, but you send it to a receiver that shares a body of knowledge. And so if you remember, I guess the most extreme example was that couple who used to know all the dirty jokes, and they would just recite numbers to each other and start laughing, and the husband would say 37 and the wife would say 75, and I don't remember how the joke ends, but the point is you just expand these macros because you share a body of knowledge. And that's a much more interesting one. You really can trade off bandwidth with intelligence because of knowledge. So that's sort of trend number 3, which is definitely happening. And trend number 4 is, and again, these are not separate, but you'll see how they come together. Trend number 4 will be reminiscent to a couple of people in this room who go back to the old days when we looked at desks, and we looked at sort of the so-called desktop metaphor, and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to build computers that sort of took from the desk not only the familiar objects, but kind of the motor memory reinforcement that comes from working in that kind of space. And I think I noticed Dick Bolt in the room. It might amuse you to see this slide. It goes back, I believe, to 1976, maybe it's 77. And on the screen in the distance was what really was the world's first desktop metaphor. And there was a little cursor, which was just this translucent square. And Dick and I actually got into trouble because there's a calculator, which you can't see through the Trinitron shadow mask, but when you moved that over to the calculator appeared on the screen, and you touch it and so on. And one person in Washington actually got so furious at a presentation, slammed the door, and then didn't leave it at that, came storming back into the room, making as much noise as possible coming in, and finally said, you know, you arrogant bastard from M.I.T. spending taxpayers' money putting a goddamn calculator on the screen when I can buy one for $11 or something, or $12. And that was, whether it was 1976, 77 is not important. Today you can't buy a computer that doesn't have a little pop-up or pull-down calculator on it. And what's happened is that to have a sort of a kind of a unified workspace has become so much more important that we've forgotten that just in a very short period of time, these things have sort of migrated into our lives. And this sort of image is in fact really was quite impressive. You've moved the cursor up to, I don't know if you can make out, sort of below, actually it was a zoom at the top, but below those were two TV sets, and you could zoom into them, and you literally got Columbo, the TV program. And the only reason you got Columbo was because the video discs delivered at the time only had Columbo on them. At least that was the only movie segment. And again, it looked like what we now call multimedia 18 years later. And it sort of worked, and of course migrated to screens like this. But the truth is it doesn't work in the long run. And that's what's important about this trend. And the reason it doesn't work in the long run is because people don't want to directly manipulate computers. So we've kind of made it easier to do, but truthfully it's not what people want to do. And people really do want to delegate things. And the trend toward delegation and away from direct manipulation is very important. And probably of the four trends, is probably the most important. If for no other reason, as things start getting tiny, let's say that this remote control unit were the computing device that I'm interacting with, direct manipulation works fine when there are two buttons, because that's actually what I'm doing. But if it had a lot more functionality, and finally, all I can do is delegate, I'm probably going to have to use speech, and it's sort of the whole world of delegation plays into miniaturization, plays into, again, mobility. So all of these things combined are really sort of going to be an important impact. Now let me sort of kind of temporarily stop there and jump to a second thing before I try and integrate it. The second thing will be, as I said before, familiar to people at the Media Lab, but there's something that in a lot of talks that I've given, have accused of being sort of a national disease, and that disease is incrementalism. And that we tend to sort of just think too incrementally, and we tend to be satisfied by making little kind of improvements. And that really is a terrible tragedy, and the question is, how do you correct it? I mean, how do you get sort of new ideas? Where do they come from? How do you get people to sort of stop being incrementalists? And I'm not going to give a lecture on creativity and how you build laboratories and how they're dependent on cultures and all the rest, but one remedy or one antidote to incrementalism is taking a very different perspective on an old problem. And perspective is really worth 100 points of IQ. Okay, I don't care how smart you are, but perspective is worth a lot more. So if you had your IQ test recently and it was below 100, don't worry. If you have a lot of perspective, you're still in good shape. And I thought what I would do is take 4 examples, and I don't want to embarrass people in the laboratory, but take 4 examples from projects in the lab that I think have interesting, new, or at least allow others, even if the person didn't have the insight at the time, to have new perspective. And I picked one problem, the problem being video, since everybody's interested in video. And the first of the 4 is one that you all see every day. Sorry, I want to go over this one. Is what I think most people in the lab are calling extruded video. And the more I talk to people about extruded video, the more they start thinking about video differently. First of all, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's simply imagine taking the frames, nothing very sort of complicated, and stacking them up as they come out over time, except you keep the edge pixels. Okay? So as you're stacking them up, you see the edge. And the edge isn't very meaningful at first glance, and you say, well, it's sort of interesting. But if I were to take a video camera and point it to the leftmost person here and then swing it over and rightmost person and do that at the right speed, I really would get a picture of the audience along that edge. And there are not enough people in this room who look old enough to remember the class pictures that had sort of like a 1:5 aspect ratio where everybody in class lined up. There was one of those cameras that rotated the lens, and some smart ass on the right would sort of run behind everybody and come up and be in the picture twice. Enough people seem to remember that. At any rate, it's basically what happens when you take that sort of leftmost column. In fact, I think I've kept here, it's not a great slide, but you can literally see where this was done for a conference. In fact, it's unfolded, I think, in the next one. So here we're just actually unfolding it. So that conference is not video as we know it. In other words, it's not a frame of video. It is the edge pixels of, in this case, the leftmost column over time. Now, that's what I consider a different perspective, and ironically, the next slide I'm going to show you was done first, chronologically, but it does inspire you to think what happens when you start cutting this in different directions, and Ted Adelson did this, as I said before, where he did it at ankle length of some children crossing the street, and this is sort of example number 2. This one, I didn't admit it for about 24 hours to myself or to anybody else. I didn't really understand why walking, when you cut off at ankles, gave a braided pattern. And then when you think about it, it actually is quite obvious because one foot is obviously touching the ground while the other foot's going forward, and while the other foot's swinging, which is, so to speak, the braid, the first foot is clearly, since that's the axis in time, is standing still, so the feet pattern literally do, if you think about it, make a braided pattern. And what's interesting about that is something that we haven't answered, at least to my knowledge, I don't know if we've answered, but there seems to be some evidence that there might be signatures in those. Maybe you have to look at multiple levels. Maybe you can tell that it's Nicholas crossing the street, and maybe my gait is in fact in there, and maybe I actually have to slice it in a different way. But again, it's a different perspective, and I find this sort of thing again, very refreshing and hardly incremental. My third example, it comes from a misunderstanding that Dave Small here. I don't want to embarrass people, but we sort of talked one day, and the idea was well, what he did is actually more important. He just took the first half hour of The Wizard of Oz and found the frame cuts and put the sort of, it's not really a postage stamp version because it's probably 25% of the resolution of NTSC, but went ahead and put the pictures each time he found a cut, and if he didn't find a cut, he just moved along in time. Now, so many of you have seen this and lived with it, you probably don't appreciate sort of at least what it showed me for the first time, and that was that when David did this, the big black space on the first row intrigued a lot of people. It clearly was where she was singing a song. And in the days of doing The Wizard of Oz, people didn't make cuts, I guess, in the middle of songs. But what that means is that if you look at this picture, and nobody's ever seen a half-hour video laid out like cards on a card table, what it means is that you actually get the texture of the sound in that picture. You're not getting the sound, but you are, in fact, getting a little bit of the texture of that movie in terms of both sound and picture, music and voice, and so on. And I find, again, that's the kind of perspective that is, I think, pretty damn interesting. And my last one, which won't surprise people who live in the building, is this one, which, again, is just a very interesting perspective on video in a different way. And when Walter Bender, who I know isn't in the audience, when Walter Bender and others started this, the idea was really to pull resolution out of time. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this image, the first four on top are selected frames from Super 8 video that are in a stream of 100 or 200 frames that are then printed in much higher resolution by looking at the whole family of frames. And at first we thought, well, what we could do is pull resolution out of time, because if my tie was in different places and different sub-pixel boundaries of the various edges would be such that if I had enough of those, I could get more resolution. But something much more interesting happened. And again, you'll see that it was a person zoomed in. And when you start adding these together, and it's hardly as trivial as I'm making it sound, you end up with an image where the number of pixels per inch are much higher around Yo-Yo Ma's face than, of course, they are on the edge. And what that reflects is not just the computation that was possible because of the zoom, but to some nominal degree, at least, it reflects at least the cinematographic intent that was there when the person zoomed in. So this is, again, it's a slightly different perspective. So what I'm going to do now is hope that you'll buy the argument that perspective is worth 100 points of IQ. If not 100, at least it's worth 10. I mean, it's a non-zero number. And take the four trends, and what I want to try and do is, as I said, explain what seems to be going on and what will happen in the future. And again, with a slightly different perspective. All the rest of the images that I'm going to use are really simple diagrams, a few of which I've never seen before, so we'll see how this works. But it's basically, what is the single biggest change that will happen in the next 10 years in the media industry? Okay. What is the single biggest change? And we probably would all leap and say, being digital. Well, that is a big and important change, but it's not the biggest, probably. The biggest is that we have always assumed, and there are only two of these slides, that information and entertainment went directly to people. And the single biggest change will be that it won't go to people, that it'll go to machines. And that change is going to almost drive everything. And some people say, well, but we've been doing that because we deliver signals to television sets, we deliver signals to fax machines, but all those machines are doing is they're taking the signal that isn't in human readable form and converting it. They're not doing anything else. And so the question is, what are the other things that will happen? And out of that, I think, you get your chance to nail me with the questions. I think that you're going to find sort of a lot will come out of it. Now, being digital is pretty high on the list too, and it's probably explains the time. Why didn't this happen 3 years ago, and why does it wait until sort of now? And my answer is that the timing is completely driven by being digital. Namely, until the last straw fell, which was video, until you had everything in the digital domain, you couldn't think about a seamless media world. Because it was always kind of this, the odd man out was video. But as soon as that happens, it doesn't only become seamless, but this assumption that we have sort of different bit streams that are going along, that one's called video, one's called audio, and one's called data, absolutely vanishes. I mean, I cannot tell you how gratuitous that is. And you hear people, saying, I'm in the datacom business, or I'm in the video business, or I'm in, and the answer is rubbish. You're just pushing around bits. And this world starts to sort of commingle, and this is why it becomes so interesting, because people say, well, being digital allows me to sort of compress my data, so I can use a transponder on a satellite 4 times, 10 times as efficiently, which makes a lot of business sense if you're paying $1 million a month for the transponder. Or if you've got a crummy cable, which most people have, who are in the cable business, it's noisy, they can error correct and deliver studio quality images, and that's, as our friends in California would say, a no-brainer. But those aren't the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the fact that they commingle and that you can embed bits now that describe other bits, something the computer industry has done for years, but the media industry doesn't think about. And when I say the media industry, I'm really talking about the content providers. Content providers haven't started thinking very much about delivering bit streams where in the bit stream is data about what the bit stream is and sort of points back to it as a table of contents and an index. So that's a very big change. So all these bits start to sort of commingle and they get sent to you. And in these diagrams, people are circles and machines are squares, for better or for worse. This is a relatively ugly situation because you get sort of inundated, and as you sort of start putting the machine, the first thing that happens is that people say, well, we'll put this machine there because we can data compress, we can send you a few bits, and out comes, like instant coffee, once you add hot water, out comes the full thing, the full scheme. So we deliver very few bits, and it gets expanded. That's not very interesting. It's real, but it's not the most interesting. The interesting is the reverse, and that's when you put in a lot of bits and out come just a few. And that's singularly the most important new business that the media companies and the computer companies have for the next decade. And I visited, and I won't mention the name because not only is it a sponsor, but it's a very big company. The CEO told me, he said, son, boy, I love that term. I'm just old enough to like being called son. He said, son, we're going to have a new slogan for our company, and our company is going to be, our slogan is anywhere, anytime, anything. And I said, oh, sir, he didn't like that. You've got the sign bit wrong on every one of those words. You want nothing, never, nowhere, unless it's important. And I thought that, this company was really going to go out and use this slogan, anything, anytime, anywhere, whatever it was, which is absolutely absurd. You really want less bits, not more bits. You just want the right bits, okay? And so how do you figure out which the right bits are? You can't do it yourself. And if you think you can do it yourself, you're fooling yourself. You have to delegate, okay? And you already do. It's not just people who have secretaries and human agents around. You already entrust implicitly certain people to do certain things for you or to bring up certain things. And my God, this happens all the time over the internet with email, where somebody sort of sees a story and posts it on a bulletin board or sends it around. Those are agents. They happen to be humans filtering things for each other. So we really are already doing this, and it's really quite, it's really, enormously important, and probably, as I said, the single sort of biggest industry that will sort of emerge. Well, why is there, this I hope sounds obvious, why is there any room for confusion? And the reason is the following. We've ended up with a kind of screwy infrastructure. We've got an installed base in the United States of about $60 billion of copper twisted pair. And you don't really want to blow it away in one swoop. And you've got, and I don't know its actual value, a certain amount of coax that the cable companies have put in. And we've had, until recently, mind you, it's changed very recently. By very recently, I mean in the last 3 or 4 months. We've had this kind of sort of dichotomy, but that was driven more by bandwidth and more by sort of whose path into the home was going to dominate. Now the answer to that question is simple. There will be no dominant player, but for the time being, there really are 5 paths into the home. They may converge into 4, but there's satellite, there's terrestrial broadcast, telephone, cable, and package media. Package media means cassettes and stuff like that, but it also includes newspapers, magazines, and the like. So when somebody, usually it's with child labor that it's been delivered, they hurl the Wall Street Journal or the Boston Globe across your transom. That really is a megabyte per whatever half second it took to go through the transom. It's delivered as package media. And many people, in fact most people, get most of their bits that way until I guess you turn on the television, and if you really do turn on the television as much as everybody says, that's certainly going to be most of the bits, at least for a while. So what's happened with those channels? Well, you hear about people who are now going to take a very broadband channel and they're going to deliver you 1,000 programs of television. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that that's probably a very dumb idea, because not too many people want 1,000 channels. In fact, it is such a dumb idea that a lot of the bandwidth will be even used up gratuitously. There are people who are suggesting what we'll do is we'll give you 1,000 channels, but we'll take a popular movie and we'll throw it onto 10 channels, staggered at 10-minute intervals. So it goes on at X, but then if you have to run off to use the bathroom or take a telephone call, you can tune in 10 minutes later to where you left off by just jumping to the next channel. And that's just, again, if you've got infinite bandwidth, you can simulate switching, obviously, but it's just a gratuitous way to do it, and this makes it a little bit suspect. So people look at this, and you ask somebody, you say, do you really want 1,000 channels? And of course the answer is no. But what you'd like is you'd like one channel, and you'd like to be able to switch it into any one of whatever. 50, 100,000 sources. And that becomes a little bit more interesting, but then you really say, my God, how am I going to figure out which one to get and what's out there, et cetera, and it becomes the video rental store problem. I don't know if you have the problem I have, but I've stopped going because I just always walk out with a movie I've already seen or I would never want to see. And I've never managed to walk out. Some people are real pros. They can read the spine and figure out what it is. Making that selection is probably the interesting business again. That's sort of what you would really like is help in making the selection. But let me leave that for later if I have time. The point is that channel that can now be very thin. And what interests me, doesn't seem to interest the phone companies as much, is that channel can be copper twisted pair. So you all of a sudden have, in my opinion, a more interesting architecture where you use the copper to switch into, the installed base, to switch into whatever it may be, n thousands of sources. Now, people say, well, this is only temporary. True. Not only is it only temporary, but all this business about information highways and the government helping to stimulate our infrastructure strikes me as a little bit bizarre, because nature's going to do it. We don't need Al Gore. Nature will produce all of the fiber. And the reason nature will produce it is that it is already cheaper to put in fiber than copper in any line that's over, you can argue whether it's 300 yards or 250 yards, but it's a small number. And by that I mean not only the cost of the fiber, but including the transducers. There is a length, and again, people may argue whether it's 250 yards or 350 yards, but it's a small number, such that when you dig a ditch or you lay whatever you're going to lay, you might as well lay fiber, because it's more expensive, especially if you include the maintenance cost. It's more expensive to put in copper. And the American telephone plant renovates itself at 5% per year. which means if you're always renovating a different 5%, which is obviously not going to be the case, is that nature will do its job in 20 years. Namely, we don't need to do much legislation at all to inspire fiber to go into the infrastructure. We really don't. You see, let me actually backtrack for a second. When Judge Green broke up the telephone company, rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, he decided that the phone companies couldn't be in the information business. Now that's not really true. You all know the phone companies in the information business. They just happen to deliver it with books again that go across transoms, yellow pages, white pages, and whatever. They couldn't be in the electronic delivery. They couldn't own the information. When the phone companies decided they wanted to get into that business, they argued to Congress and other places, they lobbied, that in order to pay for the infrastructure, the fiber, they had to be allowed to get in that business to justify it. Well, they won their argument, but then they made the mistake of believing their argument. Okay? And they really shouldn't believe the argument, because you don't need the bandwidth to start providing innovative services. And that's sort of a tragedy. But now the install base comes. I mean, by install base, I mean nature provides the bandwidth. And if I can back up on this, which I will do, yes, there we go. Instead of thinking of the pipe this way, which is the way every cable operator thinks about it, is to think about it the way probably everybody in this room thinks about it, and that is rotate it 90 degrees, turn it all into packets. And then you just use the broadband in exactly the same way that we're using the narrow band, and you're just downloading packets. Whether the packet is 1 hour of video or 5 minutes of video doesn't make much difference. It's a downloading phenomenon. And so, with or without bandwidth, you still have the notion of you at your receiving end getting basically a personalized channel of video. Let me try and characterize that in another way. Many people, again, people in this room here from the Media Lab, know that there is it's not a policy, but it's certainly a spirit that media in general become more and more and more personalized. And again, this was heresy 3 or 4 years ago, but is kind of being accepted now. One of the first things you get asked, or at least I get asked, is how are you going to protect people, privacy, issues like that? And the answer really comes from taking these 3 things and looking at how do you personalize the bit stream? How do you figure out which bits? And the answer is there are 2 ways. And it's not that one's going to prevail. They're both going to happen. And the first is that you're going to do it in your receiver. Okay, there's going to be a bit stream, rather broad one, and a number of them are going to be collected for you. So you come home at night and your machine says, my machine says, Nicholas, I looked at 42,000 hours of video today and have collected a half hour of stuff that I think you really be very interested in. Your friend Horacio Regini was on a talk show in Argentina. Your so on and so forth, and there it is. What it's doing is it's just sort of listening, basically, to the bit stream and pulling ones out because of whatever slugs happen to be either in the bit stream or it actually, in the long term, looks at the bit stream itself. That agent, that's pretty personal. That's pretty safe. Okay, it's in my home. It's listening to the bit stream. It's a little bit like an automobile radio that doesn't get turned off. But this is only one of 2 ways. And the second way is where you have to go back and you've got to take from some sort of central source and figure out which bit stream. And this is where you have to entrust to the network to do that for you. Now, when do you have to resort to that? You could argue never. This is the only kind of media you're interested in are the ones of the previous slide that come sort of get pulled, which is fine. Okay, that's perfectly satisfactory way. Maybe the dominant form of this sort of personalized media over the next few years will be of this form. But if I want to start pushing more and more apparatus into the network, and I want to sort of relate things, a trivial example is to set the alarm clock so it rings 45 minutes. We're going to become very narcissistic, small people. We're only going to get the news we want to get. We won't have these common subjects, sort of the headline news that people can chat about in the morning. My answer is obviously no, not at all. And then people don't understand why. People say, well, it doesn't make sense. I mean, why is that not going to happen? And the reason it's not going to happen, and what people tend to forget, and it really is something that, I don't know, maybe somebody in the audience can tell me why, is if you move this little slider around, and you can put in your own numbers, but quite frankly, at 7 o'clock Monday morning, I'm not too interested in serendipity, okay? If somebody put their chihuahua in a microwave oven to dry it, okay, and pushed the button and watched the little dog explode, I'm not interested in hearing about that Monday morning at 7. I might sort of graze the newspaper and look at it very differently at 3 o'clock. But that's a continuum, okay? And most people just fail to recognize that. They fail to realize whether you explicitly move it back and forth or whether it's something that happens because your, quote, agents know something about you. It really is very, very different. It's, really drives a great deal of the media industry can become news. And the reason advertisements tend not to be news, the only time they are, again, they fit on a spectrum, and I wish I had made a slide that showed the spectrum, where sort of classified ads might be at one end and sort of, oh, I don't know, Winston or Absolute Vodka or something might be on the other end. And again, there's a continuum. And in that continuum, news and advertising really overlap. And if you're about to take a trip in the middle of August to Scotland and the system all of a sudden produces for you an Orvis catalog, you might be kind of a little bit more receptive to it. And even if you're not a fly fisherman or fisherwoman or whatever the unisex version of fishing is, you probably, yes, for the last few words I may have departed with you, because I think the fact that we put those, and newspapers are the closest, they actually make slugs that are in the beginning of news stories, which sometimes they're kept on online systems, sometimes they're not, but a slug tends to be very small. People tend not to make too much so-called, what you're calling metadata, in the first place, and they're going to have to make more. In the long run, you're going to actually look at the bit stream. You won't be even dependent on whether somebody's thought of indexing it in the first place. And the whole sort of human indexing process is really an interim process. Now, whether it's a process that we use for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years is another issue. Thank goodness in our business it doesn't make too much difference whether it's 10 years or 20 years. But it really is an interim process, and yes, we need to provide the tools for people to do that.
From looking at the slides, we've shown a situation in which there's an accumulator of interesting artifacts from the network, and at the other end of the spectrum, there's an element of trust of the network to provide you that which somehow you've designated as interesting. In order for your home filter to provide you with interesting material, it must have access to the universe of interesting facts. Now, if you have a narrow pipe between the switch and the home, then your home filter won't have access to the entire universe of interesting facts. So it's almost inevitable that there will have to be some element of trust in the network so that you can get the data you need.
Aşamadım dedi.